One more name, Brock Lesnar.
You know, he's doing his thing right now with the WWE. One of the things about Brock Lesnar is when that guy's ready to fight, he's not shy.
Nobody knew he was around. It was one of those deals that if you don't get him right away, he's going to be out there and people are going to know who he is, and then you're going to be fighting everybody.
Hey guys, Jimmy Smith here. Look, we know how promoters are. Ruthless, they're conniving, they're greedy, they have dreams too. And one of their dreams has to be that amazing crossover fighter that every fan can recognize. You love him, you hate him, doesn't matter. You want to pay money to watch them fight. In the perfect situation, they would also have a built-in fan base. Would look like an action figure in real life, they could talk trash, and have an exciting style to go with rugged good looks and a mean mug that you love to hate. In that sense, Brock Lesnar was a promoter's dream come true. He had a built-in fan base as a top star in the WWE, and not just a top star, a crossover sensation that the average person who wasn't a fan of the WWE at least knew who he was. His ride to the top was a bit controversial because, let's face it, you have to fast track a guy like that to the top. They don't do what everyone else does, meaning climbing the ladder, beating contenders, showing what they have against mid-level talent. When you have a guy like Brock Lesnar, you take him straight to the elite and see what he can do. And love him or hate him, he did pass the early tests against some of the greatest heavyweights in UFC history.
Right in, squeezes it tight.
You could see by looking at Brock Lesnar that he had incredible physical talent, but he also went through some veteran fighters, he won some decisions, and showed guts in a comeback win over Shane Carwin. Unfortunately, you could also tell by looking at Brock Lesnar that PEDs probably played a huge part in his success, and his failed drug test is a gigantic part of his heavyweight legacy. Brock Lesnar remains controversial to this day. He wouldn't make most people's all-time list of great heavyweights, but everyone saw him, everyone knew who he was, and everyone was engaged in that brief period of time in the UFC heavyweight division because of Brock Lesnar. As we get started, don't forget to smash that subscribe button like Brock Lesnar smashed his way through the UFC heavyweight division. I can freely admit that I'm a wrestling dork. And I don't mean the WWE, I mean college wrestling, freestyle wrestling. I watch it all the time, and I try to keep up on the best athletes in college and at the international level. As a wrestling dork, I remember distinctly 1999, junior year in college, watching a junior college transfer make his dual meet debut for the University of Minnesota in the heavyweight division. It was against the University of Iowa, and this massive heavyweight cradled a guy named Wes Hand, who ended up getting an All-American honor that year, putting him on his back and pinning him. That was an incredible achievement. Falls at the D1 level are extremely rare in NCAA wrestling. In a division full of absolute giants, Brock Lesnar was just on another level. He continued his wrestling success, making 2 NCAA finals, and the only thing that kept him from being a 2-time champion was a future world champion from Cal State Bakersfield named Stephen Neal. He was physically dominant, and he continued that run for 2 years. As distinctly as I remember his run through the NCAA championships, I also remember the day he was signed to the WWE. The first thing I thought was, man, he would have been great in MMA. Turns out he would get his opportunity. I haven't been a pro wrestling fan since I was 13 years old, so I can't speak intelligently about his first run through the WWE. What I can say is that even though I wasn't a fan, I knew he was successful. I knew he was impressive. I knew the fans loved or hated him. I knew he ascended to the top of the sport and became a champion. The fact that as a non-fan I knew all of that means he wasn't just big, he was crossover big. A lot of people forget that before he fought in the UFC, he made his MMA debut at a K1 event called Dynamite in 2007. It was a big show at the LA Coliseum, but most American fans didn't know what K1 was, and the show was not a gigantic success. His opponent was a guy named Min Soo Kim, an unknown South Korean fighter with a record of 2-5 at the time. Brock simply destroyed him. Took him down, transitioned to the mount, unloaded some short strikes until Kim tapped out. The fight lasted about a minute. The main takeaway from that fight is that Brock didn't try to do too much. He had a simple takedown, simple passes, some good physical pressure, and he could generate power at a very, very short distance. Anyone with MMA knowledge could see that with a little seasoning, the right training, good coaching, he could maybe be a factor in the sport. But the problem was that he was already 29 years old and had a lot of miles on him. Given his popularity, he would have to jump into the deep end of the pool, and boy did he. Brock Lesnar made his UFC debut at UFC 81 February February 2008, a mere 9 months after his MMA debut. This career trajectory was almost unheard of in the sport. Not since the early days of MMA did someone make their UFC debut in their first couple fights against a talent like Frank Mir, who was a former undisputed heavyweight champion. A lot of people in MMA thought this was too much too soon. Not only was he getting a pay-per-view slot based on his popularity, even the most neutral pundit didn't think he had much of a chance against a guy with the ground skills and mobility of Frank Mir. By the way, let us know if you were one of those people in the comments section. Did you think it was too much too soon at the time? Frank Mir, a gigantic name. One thing most people don't know, because they weren't wrestling dorks like me, is that Brock Lesnar had real D1 wrestling credentials. Frank Mir said in an interview later that other fighters said he had to defend MMA from this pro wrestling guy. They didn't understand that he could really wrestle, and he was a real physical threat. Frank completely understood that. People have tended to forget that this fight was a bit controversial. Brock Lesnar started off doing great, getting a takedown in the first 10 seconds, and unleashing some devastating ground and pound right off the bat. Frank Mir seemed to be in recovery mode almost instantly and was fighting back with everything he had, but Brock was doing great. Then, Steve Mazzagatti, one of the worst referees in MMA history, screwed everything up. He broke up the action when Brock was on top and deducted a point from him for hitting behind the head. Now, some of his strikes did hit behind Frank Mir's head, but Frank Mir was moving a lot, and the rule is you're not allowed to target the back of the head. If someone moves their head into your strike, that is their problem. This was a little bit iffy, and it looked like Brock was in a dominant position. After the stand-up, Brock knocked Frank Mir down again, was landing more ground and pound, but then got in a scramble with the jiu-jitsu ace and ended up giving up a knee bar a minute and a half into round number 1. Although the fight ended quickly in a submission win for Frank Mir, you could see the potential. Brock could really move for a guy his size, he was explosive, he could also generate a lot of power from a very short distance, and he had confidence on the ground. One question on the mind of a lot of MMA analysts was, could he win a long fight against a veteran fighter? Well, we would soon find out with his next UFC appearance. Brock's next fight was against Heath Herring, a 6'4" heavyweight who would be a title contender in Pride. Brock knocked Heath Herring down almost immediately. He got the takedown early in round number 1 and dominated the entire 15-minute fight. He showed his ability to ride even a big heavyweight with a lot of experience and keep them down. He kept physical pressure on and unleashed ground and pound that was absolutely devastating. More importantly, he showed he could win a decision. He could take a full fight all the way to the end and win. His gas tank could do it. He was physically dominant, but didn't need to finish someone early. That was a huge statement to the MMA fans, whatever his future was. At this point, he showed he was a real threat at 265. Brock Lesnar's next fight was against Randy Couture for the UFC Heavyweight Championship at UFC 91. That's right, you heard me correctly. One win in the UFC against Heath Herring, a single dominant performance, got him a title shot with a professional record of 2-1. To say this decision was controversial is a bit of an understatement. Yes, fans understood his undeniable appeal and his clear talent, but even that incredible combination didn't warrant a title shot against a UFC legend in the eyes of most fans. But of course, in the world of combat sports, money talks and BS walks. And despite anything else you might think, Brock Lesnar drew big money. So he got an opportunity at the title at UFC 91 against an aged but still dangerous legend. This was a weird time for the UFC heavyweight division. Randy Couture was a 3-time champion, but he had kind of stepped away from the UFC with a protracted legal battle wanting out of his contract in order to fight Fedor. But he had come to terms with the UFC and returned to the octagon. But it kept him out for a little over a year. When he faced Brock at UFC 91, there might have been a little bit of ring rust. In the fight itself, Randy did what he could to slow the fight down. He was an undersized heavyweight against Brock Lesnar, but Randy was undersized against almost every heavyweight he fought. He clearly believed his advantage against Brock was in his Greco-Roman experience and his fight IQ. He tried to keep the fight against the fence and drag Brock Lesnar into the late rounds. Too bad for him, it never got there. In this fight, Brock showed good patience, not wasting a lot of energy early. He got the takedown, but didn't try for an early finish. He found his opportunities even in the clinch positions and was able to knock Randy out with a short right hand in round number 2 to win the lineal UFC Heavyweight Championship. Part of the aforementioned strangeness in the UFC Heavyweight division is that with the time off, the UFC decided to have an interim heavyweight title between Frank Mir and Minotauro, where Frank Mir knocked him out in the second round. This set up one of the biggest rematches in UFC history at none other than UFC 100. It was the biggest card in UFC history, Brock was the biggest crossover star in UFC history, and Frank Mir was facing off with him in the main event to decide the undisputed heavyweight champion. Couldn't get any bigger. Let's talk a little bit about how Frank Mir was the perfect foil for Brock Lesnar. When he first faced off against Brock Lesnar, he had been in the UFC for 7 years. He was a former champion who was the definition of a dues-paying mixed martial artist. Not only had he ascended to the top of the sport, he had done it the right way, starting out at the bottom, earning his way up to the mid-level, and finally defeating the elite before snapping the arm of Tim Sylvia to win the heavyweight title. Unfortunately, injuries sustained in a motorcycle accident took him out of the game.
We're driving to the gas station. I'm going only about 35 miles an hour. I look over and I see a car taking a left-hand turn, and he's doing what most people do. They wait till the light turns yellow, and then they zip across traffic to, yielding right away. So when I zipped forward, he accelerated and he gunned it hard. I remember one big thunk on the back of my head, which I guess was the curb of the sidewalk hitting my helmet. And then I kind of did a little bit of a cartwheel and landed on the grass. I had gone about 80 feet, they said, from the point, which someone told me later on that that's a punt in football. So next time you see someone getting a punt in football, you realize I went that far.
He then defeated a legend in Minotauro to reclaim an interim heavyweight title. He was the exact opposite of Brock Lesnar. He didn't start out at the top, he wasn't handed any opportunities, he just worked hard enough to earn the respect of the promotion and the fans to be an all-time great heavyweight. On top of that, he was seen as a technician, a guy who put in the work on the ground and was one of the few truly dangerous submission specialists in the heavyweight division. He was a decent size for a heavyweight, yeah, but certainly not a monster like Brock Lesnar. He was smooth, he was aggressive, he was seen as having a very high fight IQ. If Brock was known for his incredible strength and physical talent, Frank Mir was known for his studious yet aggressive approach to the game. Brock was a wrecking ball, Frank Mir was a scientist. As I mentioned before, a lot of people saw the first fight as a pro wrestling guy with a lot of hype against a veteran with a lot of skill. Another thing that is underappreciated is that Frank is not a major trash talker. But I know Frank Mir. He's a nice guy, but he has a mean streak a mile long. He has spoken openly about his willingness to injure or permanently disable his opponent in order to win. The jiu-jitsu expression is tap or snap. And when it comes to Frank Mir, that is a literal choice every time he steps in the octagon. If you make a mistake, he will make you pay with your health. If anyone could overcome the physical tools of Brock Lesnar, yet again, it was seen as Frank Mir. Was Frank Mir the perfect foil for Brock Lesnar? Let us know in the comments section if you agree, or there's another name you can think of. Their showdown at UFC 100 was epic and personal. Brock Lesnar refused to touch gloves before the fight, and Frank Mir looked ready to defend his UFC legacy on the biggest imaginable stage. Looking back on it, there's no other way to say it. It was the greatest performance of Brock Lesnar's MMA career. He took Frank down early in round number 1 and never let him off the hook. He landed short, vicious ground and pound and did a great job reaching around the head and controlling the arms of Frank Mir. By the end of round number 1, when Herm Dean stood them up, Frank Mir's face looked like battered hamburger. Round number 2 was more of the same. After a brief exchange, Brock gets on top and mercilessly batters Frank Mir until the fight was called at 1:48 of round number 2. Brock famously got up disparaging sponsors and opponents, doing what we call cutting a promo in the pro wrestling business and ushering what might have been the Brock Lesnar era of the UFC. Hit that like button and let us know what you thought of that epic performance. It was at this point in his career that some health issues started popping up for Brock Lesnar. He suffered a bout of diverticulitis that required surgery to repair a hole in his intestine. Now, diverticulitis is essentially an inflammation of the connective tissue in the intestine. It's a very dangerous condition. It can lead to sepsis, which can kill you. This led to an alteration in Brock's schedule. He had fought 3 times in 2008, but had to take a year off between winning the title against Frank Mir and his first title defense against the hard-hitting Shane Carwin in 2010. This health issue would rear its head again and become a serious problem, but at the time, we didn't quite know how bad it was. In any event, Brock Lesnar took on Shane Carwin, UFC 116. The major takeaway from this fight is that it was the first time Brock Lesnar really had to deal with someone, well, punching him in the face, and he did not like it. It looked like this fight was going to be stopped in the opening round. Every time Shane Carwin would touch Brock Lesnar, he would shell up, he would turn away, he would collapse. To his credit, Brock was able to fight back enough in round number 1 and keep the fight from being stopped, but there was more than one occasion where a lot of referees would have intervened and called an end to this fight. Shane was on top, he was landing big punches, and Brock Lesnar seemed completely lost. The problem, if you were a Shane Carwin fan, is that his efforts to finish Brock in round number 1 left him with absolutely no gas in round number 2. Brock was able to get an easy takedown and then transition to an arm triangle to get the finish. In one sense, it showed that Brock really did have championship heart and guts. He had to rally back from behind and was clearly physically hurt in the opening round. In another sense, it showed the vulnerabilities that would cost him his title. The man had no kickboxing or striking background, and yeah, he had God-given power that made every punch he threw dangerous, but he had no idea how to defend against strikes. He didn't move his head and overreacted every time a jab made its way to his nose. A mere 4 months later, he would defend his title again, this time against a prime Cain Velasquez. Suffice to say that fighting Cain at this point in your career was like getting thrown into a wood chipper. Cain was fast, he was agile, he was explosive, and he was an All-American wrestler in his own right. Brock rushed forward and was able to take Cain down a couple of times, but that wrestling experience meant Cain knew how to get back to his feet. And once he did, Brock had no idea how to deal with the combination punching of a light, fast, mobile heavyweight. Not only that, Cain got a takedown of his own, and once Brock was on his back, let's just say operating from guard was not Brock's specialty. Cain unloaded with ground and pound, bloodied Brock's face up, and at 4 minutes, 12 seconds of round number 1, he was champion no more. Brock was then supposed to fight Shane Carwin when his diverticulitis sidelined him again. Reportedly, he had a foot-long piece of his colon removed, and it kept him out of the octagon for over a year. When he did return, he said he felt like a new man stepping into the octagon against horse meat eating Alistair Overeem. If you thought the Cain fight was a one-sided beating, watch this one. Overeem simply mauls Brock Lesnar. For 2 minutes and 25 seconds that this fight lasts, it was one-sided. Brock clearly wanted nothing to do with the strikes of Overeem and was mercifully KO'd by a liver kick finish to end the fight. Fans have speculated that it was the diverticulitis and the inability to take a body shot that led to the defeat at the hands of Overeem and shortened Brock's MMA career. I personally don't believe that was the issue. We saw in the Shane Carwin fight that Brock simply didn't have the tools necessary to engage in a striking battle with a modern heavyweight to be successful. As the strikers got better, Brock's performances got worse. He could defeat the Frank Mirs and Randy Couture's, the guys who grappled first and did everything else second. Very few people on earth can grapple with a guy the size of Brock Lesnar. He was able to use his takedown, his top pressure, his physical dominance to win those fights. When it became about athleticism, quickness, and speed on the feet, Brock just didn't have those skills. He had a natural power punch, but he couldn't take a shot as well as he could give one. And in his last 3 fights, that deficiency was painfully obvious. Remember, before he fought Overeem, he said he was 100% and feeling great. Fighters do this all the time. They say they're 100%, they say everything's fine, and when things go wrong, they claim they weren't as good as they thought they were. You can't have it both ways. If you say you're 100%, the loss is on you, not your surgery or any physical problem you're having. I give Brock a ton of credit for his wins and what he was able to accomplish being UFC champion, but I also have to give his opponents the credit for coming up with a strategy that defeated him later on after he won the title. Could diverticulitis have been a factor? Sure. But diverticulitis didn't make Brock Lesnar react horribly to getting punched. Let me know if you agree with me or if you think it was the illnesses that derailed Brock Lesnar's MMA career. After the loss to Alistair Overeem, he stepped away from MMA and returned to a very lucrative deal in the WWE. What that showed was the unbelievable crossover appeal of Brock Lesnar. He was able to go from the UFC back to the WWE and not skip a beat in terms of popularity. Back in the WWE, his UFC championship gave him that kind of badass pro wrestling credibility that is so elusive to 99% of the WWE roster. The superlatives about being the alpha male of our species and the baddest man on the planet, you can back that up when you were the UFC heavyweight champion. It was clear that Brock Lesnar carried stardom everywhere he went, from the UFC to the WWE and then back to the UFC. Fans always wanted to watch. That is something every promoter on earth would kill for. You could package it, sell for $1 million an ounce. Brock returned to the UFC one more time for UFC 200. There, he took on Mark Hunt, made a massive amount of money for one single fight, and then failed a post-fight drug test for a drug that is used to treat the side effects of PED use. The result surprised no one. It wasn't the idea that a man who has 300 pounds of muscle would be on PEDs that irked fans. It's the idea that Brock knew he wasn't going to suffer any consequences. He took his gigantic payday, the fight was turned into a no contest, and that was it. He knew he wasn't going to come back, so the suspension didn't mean anything. Mark Hunt, of course, famously sued the UFC because he argued that they knowingly allowed him to fight while doped, and the consequences weren't severe enough to keep him from doing so. He ended up losing the lawsuit, but the idea that Brock Lesnar did what he did based on his ability to take PEDs and get away with it has never left the minds of the fans. How much PED use hurts the legacy of a particular fighter is always hard to gauge. Some guys are stuck with the label of doper for their entire careers for failing one test. Others are not. With Brock Lesnar, it seems that most fans accepted the fact that he was not all natural during his UFC run or his WWE run for that matter. Let us know how you feel about Brock Lesnar's failed test. Do you believe it hurts his legacy? So, what about the rest of Brock Lesnar's legacy? Is he an all-time great heavyweight? He did tie, at the time, the record for heavyweight defenses, but there were a lot of questions about his run in the first place. His legacy was built on a 4-fight run. He beat Heath Herring, Randy Couture, Frank Mir, and Shane Carwin. Hindsight is always 20/20. When you look back at those wins, none of those guys were great after their losses other than Frank Mir, who got another title shot against Junior Dos Santos. Shane Carwin only fought one more time before retiring. Heath Herring retired after his loss to Brock. Randy Couture had some success, but never rose to contender level in the UFC again. The way I see it, Brock Lesnar was a transitional heavyweight champion. The era he overcame to become champion was on its way out, and the era that followed contained some of the greatest heavyweights in UFC history. Cain Velasquez, Junior Dos Santos, Fabricio Verdum, Stipe Miocic, Alistair Overeem. When it's all said and done, the era that followed Brock Lesnar will be remembered as the greatest heavyweight era in UFC history. Brock simply wasn't going to beat those guys. Yeah, he had a great takedown, incredible physical strength, ground and pound, and a good right hand. That isn't enough to take on the elite class of heavyweight that could do anything offensively and defensively. Had he gotten an opportunity against Junior Dos Santos, Fabricio Verdum, or Stipe Miocic, I think the results look exactly the same as the Overeem and Cain fights. Lesnar came into the UFC at the right time, the right skill set to beat the fighters at the time. What greatness Brock Lesnar had does not lie in his octagon abilities. It lies in his unbelievable popularity. He had 5 pay-per-views, sell over 1 million buys. Ronda Rousey is considered a huge crossover star. She only had 2. And when you look at all of those cards, other than UFC 100, they weren't very good. The selling point was Brock Lesnar at the top of the bill, and fans came out in droves and spent millions. These fights weren't fights, they were events, and the whole world knew about them. A Brock Lesnar fight transcended the sport of MMA. When Brock entered the UFC, it was big. When he left the UFC, it was just like him, massive.